What's the real cost of starting a farm, and can you truly balance ethics with profitability? Welcome to the Poor Proles Almanac, a show about agroecology and preparing for climate collapse by a guy who gets paid to be an accountant. These seem like two totally disparate interests, but in reality, the sustainability of alternative food systems, and even this podcast itself, is predicated on a comprehensive understanding of finance. And that's what this episode is all about. We're joined by Chris at Sylvanaqua Farms. Known for his sharp critiques of small farming on social media, where he's presently banned, unfortunately, Chris is also a small farmer with a unique perception of what the future of farming can be. Today, we're discussing his eye-opening journey from an unplanned farm business to a model of ethical entrepreneurship. Initially driven by a grim prognosis and lacking a detailed business plan, Chris's story reveals the harsh logistical and strategic realities behind the idyllic facade of farming. His experience underscores the necessity of solid business foundations, including capital, labor, and clear objectives, to succeed in this field beyond the romanticized versions. We then venture into the broader challenges of entrepreneurship, especially for those transitioning from technical roles to management. Chris offers poignant parallels between overwhelmed middle managers and entrepreneurs, illustrating the pitfalls of such transitions. We talk about Blackbird Farms and Sylvanaqua's approach to integrate agribusiness and agriculture to offset low farming margins, creating a sustainable model that pays living wages. This approach aims to enable success without the necessity of being an entrepreneur, challenging traditional capitalist structures. Finally, we delve into the socio-political implications of ethical business growth. Can that actually happen? And the role of social entrepreneurship in challenging capitalism. This is an uncomfortable dialogue for many of our listeners, as business planning, tax strategies, cash flow analysis, and business scaling are outside of the lexicon of bootstrapping socialists of various stripes. But the point we want to make is that it shouldn't be. So take a listen, let it percolate, and let us know what you think. Make sure you go and buy some chicken and eggs from Chris if you're in the DC area. And if you're interested in learning more about finance from the left, check out Common Sense on Instagram, which is my own project, to provide an easy way for people to get financial literacy where we can discuss it from a left perspective. Now, to the interview. Chris, thanks for joining us. We've been talking about this whole business side of farming for a while, and I figured it was a good time to take a whole bunch of people who don't want to learn about business and make them. So how you doing?
That's exactly what the people need, and we're going to give it to them.
We're just like bullying them into like a business class.
People are going to grow up, whether they like it or not, and they can either do it or unfollow. It's so easy either way, right?
Yeah, basically. So a long, long time ago, you thought it was a good idea to start a farm. And you're like, I've got this dream of what the future looks like. It's me and my bison, and they're free ranging and not breaking into people's houses, and it's a good time.
Mm-hmm.
And then reality sets in, right? And I'm curious about your thoughts from that state of, I'm going to build this thing that is self-sustaining and circular energy and all the good feels, to like engaging with reality, kind of what that process looked like for you.
Yeah, man. So I can declare kind of a state of temporary insanity when I first started the farm, because for people that know my story, I started the farm in part because that is what I wanted to do if I didn't have to worry about money anymore. And the reason I didn't think I had to worry about money anymore is because I didn't think I had that long to live. So things got real simple when I started the farm. I was having stress issues from my old job and that kind of thing. So I had all these symptoms of stuff that usually doesn't end well and doesn't have a great prognosis. And so I kind of jumped into farming, not really creating a business plan the way I normally would have if I was going to start anything else. So the circumstances for me were different. I was able to be a lot more kind of naive and traumatized and bushy-tailed about getting it. So when I jumped into it, man, it was, there were things I knew that I wanted. I knew that I wanted to work on landscapes, grow stuff out of the ground, help feed people. I didn't know a single blessed damn thing about how agribusiness actually works. There was a lot of confirmation bias and Dunning-Kruger involved in that. So, when I got in reading books by people like Joel Salatin, who explicitly says and brags about in his books, I've never created a business plan. I've never set sales targets. I've never done KPIs. it's stuff that would make business professors just shit, right? So, I got into it with that, basically thinking, well, my time's limited. I don't have to care that much anyway. And then suddenly I didn't die. And now it's like, oh shit, now I have to care.
You're like, fuck these kids.
Basically. So, the first time I really, 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 really took the time and the necessary kind of diligence to create a business plan and to really think about what my goals were and what I was going to do on the ground to meet those goals was with Blackbird. I didn't even do it like during the 40 acres thing. The 40 acres thing kind of happened on accident. This was just like a cancer that just metastasized over time. And I was just trying to deal with the symptoms. So Blackbird was really like the first real clean slate that I really had to do things the way I wanted to do. And when you talk about what's the difference between what you're expecting and what the actual reality is, for most people, that's kind of going to be the difference between what you see in a war movie and how wars are actually fought. So you watch the war movie, it's all shooting. Everybody's in the infantry. Everybody's a fighter pilot. Shooting, shooting, shooting all the time. In reality, 99% of the work is logistics and movement and material and strategies that are set by people 20 years before any kind of like war or conflict even happens. And those like multi-decade strategies being put into motion and then responding to the chaos when the rubber meets the road of those plans and your material and your plans and all that stuff. When that comes together, hoping that you set yourself up well enough to deal with the inevitable chaos and when your plan just doesn't go the way you think it's going to go. A business is a lot like that. That's never what anybody wants to hear, especially when you're talking about agribusiness, where people get into sustainable ag, permaculture, any of those things where your eye is on what you've seen, again, in the documentaries, the movies, the books, planting your goddamn hugelkultur beds and locking up nitrogen, doing rotational grazing and like all these other things. When it comes down to it, what makes you successful versus what makes you perhaps not, that's like maybe 5% of it. And the rest of it is going to be making sure that you have everything set up that you need to succeed. So where's your capital coming from? Who is that capital accountable to? That's extremely important when we talk about like radical entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship. What are your strategies? What are you actually trying to accomplish? Who are your partners? Where are you getting your labor force from? How are you going to pay them? What happens if the economy takes a dump, if you run into a recession, if there's another friggin' pandemic or something that shuts down part of the supply chain? Where's your material coming from? Who are you buying from? Who are your customers? How many of them are there? How much are they willing to spend? Are they willing to spend with you? Who's your competition? Like, it's all these things that are mostly done on paper that people who like to work with their hands don't necessarily, I'll say they respect it, but they don't value it because they don't want to do it. I didn't want to do it when I was jumping into it because, again, I thought I was going to die. Like, I want to work with my hands for a little bit. But, that's really the mindset that you kind of have to get into it realistically and not wind up being severely disappointed. Because if you ignore all that boring stuff and you jump in and you start doing the Saving Private Ryan shit, you're going to have to clean up after yourself eventually.
Yeah.
And it's going to be worse. Technical debt is real and it accumulates on the back end, and that sucks. So that really is the big thing about it, man. It's just there's a lot of boring stuff that has to be done up front, a lot of struts and kind of scaffolding that has to be put up before you can really run and have fun with it.
It's funny. Last weekend I was visiting some family and we visited a local organic farm where my cousin volunteers, and their situation was a story that's old as time in this country, at least the last decade. I've got this organic farm. It's my front yard of a couple acres. If I don't change something radically in the next 6 months or become a nonprofit that's like tied to something else, then like I can't keep doing this. And I'm just hemorrhaging money.
Mhm.
And the accountant in me was like, okay, like let's talk about it. How are you structured? I don't know. Like it's me. Well, that's
Oh,
that's not really, yeah. So you haven't thought about this at all, have you? What does it mean to become a nonprofit? What are the things that you have to be aware of as a nonprofit that are much more bureaucratic? And if you don't like paperwork, a nonprofit is not for you because there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot more administrative stuff. And like I do feel like the nonprofit ends up this catch-all that people like, well, if I'm a nonprofit, I don't need to make profits. And it's like, well, no, you still need to pay your bills.
right.
It speaks to this reality that I think, all really don't, because we don't necessarily want to engage with. We think if we don't engage with it, we don't have to. And I think this becomes really obvious on the internet.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of it is also domain specific. Again, when you're talking about your friend who's doing organic gardening and farming and all this earth-based stuff, like people want to try and divorce this type of work from the nuts and bolts of running a business. Like it's supposed to be on a higher plane.
Mm.
Fundamentally, it's not. Like eventually, it comes down to dollars and cents, and can you continue to afford doing what you have to do? And if you don't, you wind up where your friend is, which is staring the for-profit to nonprofit farm pipeline right in the face, and then finding out that if you start a nonprofit, it's arguably going to get worse.
I had some choice thoughts about what he should do instead. I'm not sure if he'll listen, but I would hope so. I think to your point of this idea that we have to we think of divorcing farming because it's like this altruistic thing from business. That whole concept, I think, also kind of puts business as on a pedestal, right? Where if we don't care about those things, it's either so easy and that's why we don't, and then we don't address it at all. Or the more I think like nefarious position is that it isn't easy and that you need a special like people that run businesses, quote unquote, business owners, right? That they have some like really difficult knowledge that allows them to have businesses that are successful. And that's why we either can't access it or the 180. It's kind of like the less version of the immigrant that takes our jobs, but also is living off the system. Like business owners are just like scraping money off of businesses without like any qualifications or knowledge. But also, we can't mimic what they do to make our own farms or whatever profitable, right? Like we have both ends of the same supposed business person.
Yeah. And it's a little bit of both. Back when I was engineering, we had this joke that we tell about like this aircraft mechanic. They were having some kind of issue on I don't know, some kind of aircraft engine or something, and nobody knew what the heck was going on. So they had to hire this aircraft engineer to come on and pay him $3,000 to like flip one switch. And everybody's like, what the actual hell? Like, we paid you 3 grand to flip one switch. It's like, no, you're paying me 3 grand to know what the switch was and where it is. And that's a lot of what it is. Like the stuff that surrounds the sexy part of doing the business. So all that stuff we talk about, like accounting and auditing, financial planning, and finding your lawyer and setting up the right business structure, LLC, S corp, C corp, whatever. That stuff is this quick for people who know how to do it. Who've done it before, who kind of know how to evaluate options and stuff like that. It's not that it's hard, but it is a specialized skill set that's hard to get if you've never done it before, because when you're setting up a business, you're awash in so many options and what you can do, and there's so much fucking bad advice out there. Like some of the stuff you've talked about in the Common Sense podcast, it reminds me of that. Like all the bad financial advice you see out there that could straight up get you locked up. Like there's so much bad information that honestly, I mean, what I do these days now is I do turn that stuff over to specialists. Like I could, for Blackbird, I could have filed the paperwork for our LLC. I could technically file our taxes. I could do our bookkeeping, but when you have a decent plan, and this is kind of the nice thing about if you take the time to plan out what you actually want to do and what your goals are, you can budget in for specialists to take care of this stuff. So you can spend more time doing the stuff you really do want to do. And yeah, those people have, it's both people are right when they say like, it's not that hard. They're just scraping money off the top, but also I can't do it. Like both are true at the same time.
Yeah.
And it's just, you got to suck it up. And if it's me advising new entrepreneurs about it, especially if it's your first time, hire somebody to do it, but look over their shoulder so you know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So at least you're not completely at the mercy of what other folks are doing, but it's both, and that's fine.
Yeah. And I think that's the point is that this stuff is not inaccessible, but you do have to sit your ass down and spend the time and you can learn it. It's not inaccessible. And what to me, and I'm really curious about your thoughts now, having been in this industry for a while. I deal with a lot of small business owners. They're usually not very good business people. They're usually very good at their skill set, whether that's tech, being a therapist, architect, whatever it might be. They're good at that. They're not necessarily good at business and understanding pricing and a market elasticity and scalability. And well, if I need to get this kind of profit, then I need, X amount of calls that turn into X amount of sales that turn into, so, KPIs and all those different parts that you really need like a CFO to kind of step in and say, here's all the things you should be thinking about. Here's the analytics on your financial statements. Most 75% of businesses are basically run because of some guy that's kind of eyeballing what the price should be and ends up being pretty right because like everyone else is kind of doing the same thing.
Mhm. Technicians don't necessarily make good entrepreneurs, and
Yeah.
that's what it boils down to. And frankly, that doesn't even just happen to entrepreneurs. Like that happens to people. Anybody that's ever been frustrated by a middle manager, that's usually why. It's the same effect. Like you'll have, again, going back to my old profession, you'll have a software engineer who is really good at software engineering. They were faster than everybody else. They had a better eye for architecture and then server loads and all this other stuff. And so next thing you know, they're a friggin' manager and they're not doing the thing that they were really good at. Now suddenly you're a manager. Nobody's trained you to be a manager. Nobody trained you to be a good leader or a people person or to resolve conflict or any of that stuff. So you wind up in this position where you tend to fail. And it's funny, like that's why middle managers get stuck as middle managers. Like they never get good at management, so they don't wind up becoming executives. They're stuck
Yeah.
and they kind of suck at it a little bit. So entrepreneurs, I think, go through the same thing. You've got somebody who they've got a technical skill, they want to be their own boss, they think they're going to start a business and have more independence, but what they end up doing is they fire their boss and they wind up becoming an entrepreneur. Now you've got like 40 bosses, each of whom is a client,
Mm.
and there's all that other stuff that comes with it. That's kind of one of the things that I really don't know what to do about besides what I'm doing with Blackbird, which is like acknowledging the fact that not everybody's going to be a good entrepreneur. And I think later on in the discussion, we'll also talk about like worker ownership and stuff. And my controversial opinion that even that isn't always such a great idea for a lot of reasons. So you can lose some more followers.
What we're here for. Going
Yeah.
negative. That's the plan.
We're gonna sell ourselves short, literally. But with Blackbird, our whole thing is, and I talked about this in a reel I did the other day, is trying to create a system where people don't have to be entrepreneurs to succeed and still be treated fairly and have a career path that makes sense and not have this either up or out or up and stay kind of thing, but to try to create a model where you can find where you're good and find an economic model that will justify you staying there as long as you need to. That's the hard part. I've never been able to figure out, okay, how do you make an entrepreneur out of somebody that just doesn't want to be?
Yeah.
At this point, I'm like, is that a problem we should even solve? Some people ain't entrepreneurs, and that's all right.
Yeah. Not everyone wants to work for themselves. Also, given the audience here, it's not a bad thing to not want to work for yourself or want to be an owner in a cooperative or something. Like some
Mhm.
people are just happy to go to work and go home and not have to worry about, well, is the business more profitable this year? And that's okay.
Yeah, and it's gonna have to
Yeah.
be.
One of the things I find particularly fascinating about what you're doing is that you've really made a point to try to make it with Sylvanaqua, and I'm sure with Blackbird, a business that pays a living wage, which, given what we've just talked about with the industry you're in, seems basically like trying to have your cake and eat it too. Because if the farms aren't profitable, how are you paying your labor even more? So I'm
Right.
curious a little bit about maybe what that process was for you, how you figured out how to do that, if you did, or if you're just burning cash that you've told no one about. What's going on?
Well, Andy, I'm secretly broke, and actually, you can donate to my Venmo. No, so I mean, what it is, it's not hard when you look at the model of how agriculture and agribusiness works. The problem that small farming has right now is that they're trying to be integrated, but they're trying to be tiny, and that just doesn't work. I've tried to pencil out a small farm that does, under a couple $1 million a year in revenue and tries to pay people a rate that they're worth, and I can't friggin' do it. Like it's just not there. If you're going to pay people who are doing field work, like farm work, a living wage, you're going to have to take, and I know your users aren't going to be able to see me, but like you've got the agriculture and you've got the agribusiness. The agribusiness makes way more margin, but the agribusiness cannot function without the agriculture. So this one can stand to funnel some of its margin this way towards the agriculture. And for me, that's where that living wage comes from. Like our farms, if you ask my partners now, like Dan and Mason and them, like they barely break even, if they break even. Their ability to actually make money and exist in this system And part of the reason why we're integrating their farms in the next 2 to 3 years, so they don't actually have to be separate, so we can have that big integrated thing that's talked about. But the way they make money is the stuff they do in the agribusiness. With Mason, for example, working in the shop and doing butchery, and kind of the same thing with Dan when he eventually comes down and starts, doing farmer training and that sort of off the field type stuff. That's how our system works. That's why the integration is so important. And that's one of the key differences between how we work and how conventional agriculture works, where they tend to like that firewall existing between the agribusiness and the agriculture, because in the conventional system, the farmers already own those farms. So they're not necessarily worried about living wages. These guys basically have inheritances and they're playing defense with wealth. So they don't really need to make cash flow that hard. Like, they need the value of their land to be preserved, and they need to, if possible, not lose money. Or if they do lose money, they need to be able to offset it against some other kind of income. So, they treat, and you'll know this, like, they treat their money the way rich people treat money. And it blows people's minds who haven't been in that world to see a rich guy who's got one business over here that's basically losing money on purpose, or just barely breaking even, just so they can offset money coming in from somewhere else. And it's like the complexity of rich folks' finances. It would be enough to start the revolution if anybody was ever going to have one.
Yeah.
Since we're not working with people that are inheriting their farms and playing defense with wealth, and we're trying to bring new people in and get them onto the land, we have to be really careful not to try and replicate that old world system, which was one of the big reasons I kind of lost my mind about the Justice for Black Farmers Act, because that bill was basically trying to say, let's do that kind of feudal system, but we get to play too. And it's that system's broken. Let's make a new system. This is freaking stupid. But yeah, to get those living wages, you basically have to be willing to have a part of the business not take everything it can just because it can, and to be willing to share it.
For folks that are listening, when Chris was talking about this tax benefit of farms, what you can do is, like he said, you can have two businesses, one that loses money, and it's what's called a paper loss. So it's not necessarily losing actual cash. It's depreciation of stuff that can this is something very common with landlords, where they buy a rental property, and even though they might have made $5,000 on that rental property, on paper, because of depreciation, they might have lost $2,000 or $3,000. So not only did they get $5,000 tax-free, they got to take $2,000 or $3,000 against their other income. And there's a number of ways you can do this with a farm, where the corporation that owns the farm might be renting the land from a land trust. There's a number of different ways you can kind of play with these tools. But to your point about the agribusiness versus the agriculture, could you clarify what you mean by agribusiness?
Sure. So agribusiness is everything that happens once you leave the farm. So the agriculture is your farm, your fields, your chickens, your tomatoes, your vegetables, your fruits, your friggin' marijuana, whatever the hell it is. Once that stuff is harvested and leaves your farm gate, everything that happens next is agribusiness. Everything from the transport, getting your harvest to wherever it goes, to it being processed, to it being further distributed, refined, milled, packed, sold, marketed, all that stuff is the agribusiness part. So the agribusiness part is a lot more complicated. It takes a lot more specialized knowledge than the agriculture part. The agriculture part is, for historic reasons, very, very simple, very, very straightforward and uncomplicated. The act of doing agronomy and buying equipment and all that stuff like that, the technical part of doing the farming itself is complex, more complex than people realize. We talk about or at least I talk about, kind of the brain drain out of farming, and how people think they can just volunteer on a for-profit farm and immediately be useful. So it is a skill, but when it comes to how the system works at a system level, kind of zooming out at all the different pieces that have to play together, the agribusiness part is way more complicated, way more expensive, and frankly, much more difficult, which is why there's so much more profit in it.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context, as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into the Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show. So the initial question I'd had for you about the farm, you've kind of found a way to make it profitable and paying living wages. And I know now kind of your next steps is thinking about scalability. And to your point, whether or not something like a cooperative or equity ownership makes sense. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about kind of what your thought process is around that and kind of where you see things going in the future.
Yeah, sure. And I will clarify that right now we pay our employees a living wage right now. So the two folks that work for us who aren't partners are making living wage. But right now the partners are kind of like we're like a startup. We're putting in a lot of sweat equity, but we've got a specific plan that gets us to a point where each of us are making a certain amount of money and have a certain amount of equity and worth in the business. So like full disclosure, I'm not paying myself at all, for example, from Blackbird yet. We're paying Mason. Dan's not taking a salary right now. Brian's taking a salary, but right now they're not at what I'd call a living wage type thing because we're privileged enough to be able to do that. We're trying to build this thing that is designed to pay those wages to everybody that we bring in. So I want to make sure that is clarified. But to your point, scale and integration are what is necessary for us to get there. There's just a certain size you need to be in order to generate the kinds of gross margins you need to spend what we plan to spend on overhead, including our labor, because our labor is kind of distributed all over the place. We don't consider, I don't know, there's some people that try to like wrap labor sort of like into cogs in a weird kind of way. Like, it costs this much for a chicken, it costs this much for like a person to apply this much labor to growing it. But I don't prefer to do that. I like to keep that separate. Like this is just overhead. So yeah, like there's just a certain point that you have to get to in order to be able to pay everybody fairly like that. And that's the big thing that I kind of realized about small farms is that small farms never really get there unless they wind up becoming either nonprofits or they've got what I call Jesus money, like coming out of like wherever, like coming out of a trust fund and coming out of a rob a bank every week, like whatever you're doing. But they're not like that's not coming out of their own economic engine. It's coming from somewhere else. And that's why the nonprofit pipeline is so popular. It's because people run into that wall and realize, all right, well, the money's got to come from somewhere because I don't plan on getting very big. So what Blackbird has done, I think that's different, especially in this space. Like if you look at farms like White Oak, like there's a couple others where their politics are that way on the right, like way on the right, where they're not too ashamed of saying, yeah, we're going to try to get as big as possible, even though they do the whole regenerative stick. When you're on the side of the political spectrum where I am, saying that you're planning to get big and integrated is a real good way to piss off everybody that otherwise would like you. But I think that's something we have to start to normalize and understand that larger businesses with lots of revenue that have very efficient processes that basically don't waste anything financially in terms of overhead and investment, they are in a much better position to treat their people better than a small business where every penny counts. Small businesses can be some of the most exploitive places on the planet because they have to run so hard and so lean because, I mean, every penny matters. Whereas like a JP Morgan will lose $3 million and not realize it for 10 years, if ever.
Yeah.
That's enough money.
Yeah, it's immaterial. Yeah. Like
right.
I love materiality where you can just be like, yeah, it's less than 1%. Who gives a shit? But like when you add those zeros, it's a really fucking big number.
It's a big number in absolute terms for people who are, trying to live on 40 grand a year, but to them, it doesn't even show up as rounding error.
Yeah. And to the point you made or you're making, like earlier, we were talking about like needing like a CFO for a small business because businessmen don't know how to do it. You can't
Mhm.
afford to do that. And a lot of businesses get to a point where they need that. Their revenue might be $1 million, $2 million, but their net income, the money after all their expenses, might only be 100, 150, 200 grand, which is not nothing, but you cannot hire a CFO or somebody to say, this is what you need to do to improve your margins, to do this, to do that. All those one time, oh, I could use a CFO. Oh, I could use an admin. I could use this, that, whatever.
Mhm.
When you're at that scale, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for a part-time, full-time admin, it it's a third of your profits. Like, are you ever going to recoup that money? And that's the how small farms get pigeonholed.
Yeah, because it's like if you got 50 grand, are you gonna hire CPA, you're gonna hire CFO, or are you gonna buy that new tractor, or are you gonna buy that thing that like would make your life a lot easier in the field? And a lot of people, they always want to go on offense. They want to put their money towards something they think is going to make them more money or make their immediate lives easier, not necessarily something that's going to make their business a little less frictiony in the back end,
Yeah.
even though that would probably do them more good. And that's just the way it is, man. I think one thing we have to start getting used to, and I kind of like messaged you like 2 minutes before we got on here about this, but when we talk about like, for me, business is an instrument of political change. I'm doing this not only to feed communities at this point, but feeding those communities is a political act that's tied to, how we're governed, how we use land, all this other stuff. And frankly, I see it as a way of showing what a business could be and how we could treat people and materially improve people's lives. And so for me, when I want a business to be able to do that, I have to plan for that business to become big from the outset. Whereas I think with what you're describing, a lot of small business owners find themselves, they're small, they do well, hopefully. They've got lots of clientele coming in the door, and a lot of people wind up at that weird kind of what you described, that weird middle point where it's like, I can't really handle the business that right now I'm not able to execute on because I need to hire somebody in the back end to like smooth things out so I can go after new business. Like they wind up stuck.
Yeah.
There's kind of like this step function in business where like you can't gradually and linearly get bigger. Like there's jumps, and those jumps usually involve capital. And a lot of that capital for small business owners is going to come in the form of debt, which has debt service attached to it, which further squeezes your cash flow. So it's like,
Yeah.
with us, our capital is not only coming from our partners, but we're capitalized to the point where we could make that first jump that we need to. And you just have to plan
Yeah.
each jump and where is that money going to come from and how are you going to keep that money from strangling you. But I say all that just to say this. I think it's really important to avoid that conundrum, especially when you're trying to create a business that's supposed to have political outcomes. And by political outcomes, I mean treating people well, demonstrating how a business can operate ethically towards its workers, create ownership opportunities for workers if they want it, engage with the political community and not only the political community, but the regular community. To be able to do that, you've got to plan from the outset to be large enough to have that kind of influence, to
Yeah.
avoid that trap of, well, I was small and let's see what happens.
Yeah. And you see this a lot. And we've been around the block long enough, me and you, on social media to have seen like any attempts at like, I don't know why. I feel like the left is just obsessed with coffee shops, right? Right? Where you see these things kind of like rise and fall, like, overnight because they have no business acumen and they have these like broad strokes understanding of like how to run a business and like engaging with this whole thing, like engaging with business as like this thing that you can understand and control in some capacity is like an anathema to your politics and that you have to like sacrifice, your ethical morals to be good at making sure, your employees or your cooperative members or whatever, like have a sustainable future.
Yeah, I mean, I think the left. I mean, if we're going to talk about the the left trademark, its biggest problem is itself.
Yes.
We, you know, and this is something that after the events of 2021, like was a real watershed moment for me, where the reason I've succeeded now is because I've stopped giving a shit. Because the truth is, when you look at work and how people relate to work and how they're compensated and all that, a lot of people, when you look at most people, they don't assign political value to it. Like people, for the most part, they want to go to work, they want to be paid fair, they don't want to spend their lives at work, they want to be able to buy a car, go to concerts, like, do what they want to do, go fishing, whatever the hell. And they don't want to like be on call all the time. They don't want to have a shitty boss. They don't want to be harassed sexually or otherwise. Like they just want to not be treated like shit. Like people don't want much.
The bar is pretty low.
Yeah, the bar is in hell. Like, and we could do, and that's the thing. Like that's what's so frustrating about it is that social entrepreneurs who are left leaning, who want to make material conditions better, have such a relatively easy challenge in front of them in terms of meeting the expectations of most people. But social media, man, like the goddamn internet, amplifies the voices of these loud ass people who will never be pleased, who will throw Bookchin and Marx quotes at you all day long. Like, but it just has no relation to like how we're living now. Like they there there's so much. You're gonna have to edit so much of this, man. But
No, none of it. It's all sticking. Sorry.
but it's somebody. I think somebody on your feed one day said, the problem with the left is that they're not willing to take the first step unless it's across the goddamn finish line. And like that's where we're at. It's like real people make incremental progress because we have to figure out how to improve people's material lives now and not in some orgastic future that the left trademark can envision, but has no idea how to get us there.
Yeah.
So, a lot of getting away from the, I think, you mentioned the coffee shop thing and fucking bike shops too, right? It's the same damn thing. I think it's the thing that it's so small that like entrepreneurs that decide to do something. How can you yell at a coffee shop? How can you get pissed off at a bike shop? It's a freaking coffee shop. It's a bike shop. If you start trying to like manufacture cars or like set up a multi-site dry cleaner or something like that, oh, then you're getting too big for your britches. Now you're part of the petite bourgeoisie now. And I think a lot of it, man, is that you just got to ignore that shit because honestly, at the end of the day, what are you going to do? And by you, I mean them. Like, what are they going to do? Like, they can try to cancel you on the internet. And, frankly, my solution to that has been to yell right back at them and throw it right back in their faces. Like, if anybody here is a Star Wars nerd and knows about like the whole Mace Windu Vapad lightsaber combat thing where he like uses the dark side to like fight the Sith, same damn thing. Like, throw it right back in their fucking faces. Usually shuts them up. And if you can concentrate on improving the lives of actual people, that's the support you need. Like we need to stop
Mm.
focusing on this teeny weeny little 1% of people that just always got something to say about everybody and focus on the friggin' 99% of everybody else that's just like, somebody give me some goddamn relief in this hellscape that we're in. Got to focus on them because those people are usually quiet as hell.
I would agree with basically all of that, especially the bike shops. So I feel like we're like the metaphor is like if we were at the Battle of Normandy, we are like the first group off the boat. Like we're just gonna get slaughtered trying to figure this shit out. But somebody needs to do that. Somebody needs to start the process of being
Mhm.
like, okay, let's talk about how to do business. And what kills me about this whole thing, and we've talked about this offline, is like the left has not been allergic to business. There's a very long and strong tradition of the left actually creating businesses, self-employed, cooperatives, both. So much so that the left was so good at it in the early 20th century that basically capitalism conceded everything to not fall. And it was like, please, whatever you need, here's Social Security, here's Medicare, do you want a 40-hour work week? We could maybe do a 32-hour work week. Like they were just handing shit over to the to what the left wanted because it was either that or Russia. Like they knew one of the two was going to happen. Maybe they can get away with like just keeping you at work for 32 hours. And we got so close to building like I know the left hates like a Scandinavian Nordic style economic model, but it's like a good uh, it's a hell of a lot better than what we've got now. And that would allow us to do a lot more and better things to improve the material lives of people, not just in this country, but also the global infrastructure that allows our lives to be the way it is, so that we
Mhm.
could actually feel like, oh shit, there's a war in the Congo. There's all this abuse and slavery happening. We could actually do something about it versus being like, well, what am I going to do? I have a cell phone and I have no vacation time. So here we are.
Competition is always good, and when you don't have competition, whether it's within capitalism with like fossil fuel companies just like merging and merging and merging, and you're able to get things like greedflation and corporate gouging. Kind of the same thing happened when we didn't really have communism to compete with anymore.
Mm.
When the Soviet Union fell, capitalism could go, well, guess what, bitches? This is what it's like they ripped the mask off, and it's like,
Yeah.
ah, that's what I was the whole time. But yeah, like prior to that, everything from 40-hour work weeks to just having weekends. Like, I mean, I just finished reading again, like rereading a Joe Kennedy biography about that guy's grandfather. Like this guy worked as a cooper and was expected to work 13 out of 14 days, 12 hours a day. And this was like in 1890 something, I think. I mean, it's just wild when you read like what people's lives were actually like, and how much what we take for granted now and are being able to take less and less for granted, which is the scary part, right? Like, who has guaranteed weekends off now?
Yeah.
Those gains that the left did make are just being slowly eroded. So it's a shame that we don't have that kind of global competition anymore that kind of forced capitalism to frankly adopt a lot of socialistic type of tendencies that we all take advantage of now. So now that competition has to come from somewhere else. And because, a lot of people don't want it to come from competition, like we talk about dual power and shit like that. But fundamentally, I think people have an aversion to wanting it to be a contest. But we're at war, man. Like it is what it is. And if we're going to show what an alternative could be and force maybe larger incumbent businesses that control the economy to try harder, then we entrepreneurs on the left are going to have to try to do something bigger than a goddamn coffee shop that employs maybe 5 people. We've got to start creating large businesses that start snatching market share and force these people to respond by engaging them peer to peer. Like we can't keep like nipping at their ankles without like a plan. Like Starbucks does not give a shit about somebody's independent coffee shop.
Yeah.
Like that's not going to cause Starbucks to unionize. you know but if you were to have like something like Blackbird, where friggin' 10 15 years down the road where we're deliberately going to attempt to unionize like in the German model, and we do well and we make profits and we're able to like reward all of our the handful of investors that we might have who aren't going to be expecting like 10x returns over 2 years or whatever, that's something that other businesses are going to have to look at. Because when you're that successful, other people are going to want to are going to want to give you money, are going to want to invest in you. You're going to be able to say no, which is critical. I think that's how we create this dual power thing that everybody talks about, but nobody wants to talk about the reality of capitalism isn't going to play fair and just let you like do whatever you want to do. Like they're going to fight you. They're going to try to take your market share. They're going to try to ignore you at first. And if you don't have a plan to get big enough and bad enough to be able to like body check them a little bit and to make them compete, then what the hell are we doing? And what's
Yeah.
the plan to get to this future that we want?
Yeah, it feels very much like when Michelle Obama at one of I can't remember what speech she said, when they go low, we go high. That's the left. Like as much as it's like, oh, that's liberal, but no, that's what the left does. Like we won't go low and like engage with them on their terms, on their turf.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the right has taken over rural communities, is because we go high. We don't engage with it because, they don't talk the right way, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's messy. We have to deal with it and move on and figure out a way to your point, scale up and like create a viable alternative that people can say, well, you know what? I didn't like capitalism. I mean, the thing is, like and I feel like I'm rambling now, but you talk to a libertarian and they probably hate both the rich and the government. Most of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're like, fuck Apple because they, sneak into my phone or whatever. Fuck Google because of my search engine, blah, blah, blah. On and on. Big pharma. Libertarians hate big pharma because they're poisoning you, yada, yada, whatever they kind of think, right? So they're already open to an alternative, but there is no alternative to present to them because we've done nothing. We're too busy making memes, myself included.
Yeah, and me. I mean, and the memes are so much fun and so much less risky than going $250,000 into debt like I did for 40 acres and just having it blow up in your face. And going back to your point about like the whole like storming the beaches at Normandy thing, like I think that's a lot of what it is. Like people are just scared to get shot up because you're right. Like the social entrepreneurs now who are going to try to do what we're talking about, like it's going to hurt. Like I've already had my ass shot off, and it might happen again. Like, you don't know, but I think people who are in a position to take it need to take it. Like,
Yep.
that's what I want on my tombstone. I don't want to die and just have like scratched into my tombstone that's like, he was fine. I want to say, hey, this dude died in the craziest way. Watch this. He went bankrupt 3 times trying to make this thing work and blah, blah, blah. And it did sort of work. And somebody grabbed it like 3 generations later, like, took it somewhere. Like that's what I want. But I'm going to get real heavy on the friggin' World War II quotes and memes here. But if you've seen Band of Brothers, there's this scene where Lieutenant Spears, who apparently like shot a bunch of POWs or something, he was insane. He comes across this private who's just like lost his shit. Private Blythe lost his shit. He was like hiding in a foxhole. He said, "Hey, when I fell out of the sky over Normandy, I didn't really try to find my unit. I just kind of stayed put, blah, blah, blah." And Lieutenant Spears looked at him and said, "You know why you hidden that? You know why you hidden that foxhole, Blythe?" He goes, "Oh, because I was scared." "No, Blythe, it's because you still have hope. But the only hope you have is to realize that you're already dead. Only then can you function the way a soldier has to." And that's the way I feel. Like, whatever's going to happen to me and to Blackbird in my business, like that's what's going to happen. And that's kind of and kind of the lightning in a bottle that I've gotten is I've got 3 partners who feel the same way. Mason, the guy with the big beard, he has said, "I would do this anyway, even if I had a crystal ball and knew it would fail." That's really rare to find on the left.
Yeah.
The left is terrified of imperfection, getting things wrong, failing, and losing things in order to get up to learn and win. And this is where we are. Like we have to be willing to take these lumps to move that ball forward, because
Yeah.
that's what it's going to look like. Like it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be some like orgastic, bloodless revolution where like only the bad guys get hurt, and none of the good guys get hurt. Like it's going to be messy and ugly and gross and imperfect, and unfortunately, will probably involve very boring things like talking to an accountant about how to start a damn business.
So I think that's very exciting, first off, but I get your point.
You're
I think what it really boils down to for a lot of people on the left is a lack of humility. And I do think that comes from social media, where so many people are believe objectively that they're right, that the idea that I have my political beliefs, you have your political beliefs about how things work, right?
Mhm.
That we could, I think this, I believe this is true, but I am 100% aware that I could be wrong.
Mhm.
That last part of that sentence does not exist on social media. And
Yeah.
even putting that out there is like a failure to your identity. And I think if we cannot accept that humility that we might be wrong, or if we can't, let me rephrase that. If we can't accept that we might be wrong, we can be more open to trying things that we otherwise would say, well, this isn't, this inevitably will become like just like any other capitalist scheme, blah, blah, blah. Well,
Mhm.
what if we're wrong? Like, I raised on social media on a story like this question of like, if somebody could tell you that ultimately, objectively, 100% objectively, capitalism was better than any alternative, would you accept it if that meant like any other alternative would be worse? It raises an interesting question. What's more important, your values? Or let me rephrase, I think I rephrase it a little bit differently.
Mhm.
If capitalism was the best system and you could retool it so it was equitable, but it was still capitalism where there was a handful of rich getting super rich, but everyone else did pretty well. Would you accept that as like this is the best system or not? Is it more important to be right or to have people's lives materially improved to the best they could be? And
Mhm.
for me, that question is, or the answer is, well, yeah, my goal is that people have the best lives possible. Not that I'm right. I don't give a shit if I'm right. I will very happily be wrong. I would rather know that things are as good as they could be. And I don't think that's necessarily the case for a lot of people.
There's kind of a lack of curiosity, right? Like people latch on to their values and they sacrifice curiosity in the process. And a lot of how I wound up where I am now is that I was willing to be wrong about small farming, and that was not easy for me. And I consider myself to be a pretty naturally curious person. I come from a scientific background where we're kind of trained to like don't believe in your hypothesis. The hypothesis is just a thing that you test from every angle. And even with my background, like it was hard to sit there that one day and think and like go over the numbers about like how much food do people eat in this country and how many small farms would it take and is that practical? That was a difficult psychic exercise for me to go through.
Yeah.
And then to go through it and realize I don't think we're right. Especially when, I've quit my job. I've moved my family to Charlottesville. Like I've really sunk a lot into this idea. Oh shit. you know, we invest a lot of ourselves into the ideas that we create. And it's just part of our psychology. The brain is risk averse, and that's something we have to deal with. But the thing is, man, like, when we talk about the online left, the terminally online left, the thing that keeps me going is that it's these unpleasable people. It is a small, small, small number of people. And I think everybody else, I'd kind of refer to them as like Schrodinger's left. You lift the box, maybe they're leftists, maybe they're not. It all depends on like who is affecting their lives in a positive direction right now.
Yeah.
And who do they attribute that positivity to? And in order to do that, I think we have to be willing to take those risks, and for the people who are able to stomach it, to create the systems and the institutions that we need that right now do not exist to affect that change, and to bring recruits into our cause, and kind of move the inertia away from people. Like you talk about this a lot, like the left looks for apostates and traitors where the right is looking for recruits. We need to get more into a way of recruiting by meeting people's actual needs. And like that's what it comes down to, like the whole Bill Clinton thing. Like it's the economy, stupid. Like getting into people's pockets, like showing them, creating examples of new types of institutions that, again, like if we, I have no intention of making like some super egalitarian kind of business or whatever, because I don't know how to do it. Like that's outside of my skill set. Where I could go is where like business owners under Eisenhower republicanism worked, where they were bragging about how many taxes they paid and bragging about how unionized their workforces were and how much they paid. Like it's hard to believe, but if you go back to like shareholder reports for like GE or Martin Marietta, like those old school companies, like back in the 50s and the post-war era, going all the way up into the Cold War, you wouldn't recognize the language from their shareholder reports because they brag about shit that now would cause a shareholder revolt. Like they brag about what they do for the country, how much money they give away, how much they raise employee salaries, how nobody's living hand to mouth, nobody's on public. Like they bragged about that shit back in the days. Now we've kind of metastasized into this extreme shareholder capitalism where it's just like employees, the environment, the public, everything is a cost center.
Yeah.
And they're just going to minimize it no matter what. We have to show what it's like for that not to be the only way.
I do find that when you do get somebody on the left to actually open up to a conversation like this, it usually turns into this question of like, well, we need more cooperatives. There's nothing inherently wrong with cooperatives, but it does become this kind of catch-all that doesn't really mean anything because they don't really understand how business works or the complexity of like setting up a cooperative. And I'm saying that as a tax person who understands like, okay, if you have shareholders, how are you divvying up shareholder equity? What are you doing when people quit? Or can you fire them if they have equity? Have you thought about all these things? Because that is a very messy situation with significant tax consequences and, changes about how everything is done for your business. Not to say you can't do it, but this idea that like we can all just create cooperatives and it's going to solve everything is like it's almost childish.
It's what's in the playbook, right? And I get into these conversations with people often when they ask me, is Blackbird a worker-owned cooperative? And I say no, and then I say hell no. We offer paths to ownership for people who want it and display a talent for it. But the question I throw back at them is, why do you want to be a cooperative? And it always comes down to a desire to prevent exploitation. That opens up a hot mess. Like one of the things that if you read the economic history of how we got from kind of a post-war era and even a pre-war era, like kind of starting out of the Depression where you had a lot of like left-leaning labor organizing and We really had this momentum behind the labor movement. And then into the Reagan era when globalism, inflation, and all stagflation resulted in what we have now. When you look at that, there's no institutions that can protect you from the human spirit. If people decide to get nasty, they can do an end run around any institution, whether it's a privately owned corporation, a worker-owned cooperative, whatever. Like there's no way to institutionally prevent people from being as dickish as they want to be. It comes down to culture. It comes down to that James Baldwin quote. And I quote this all the time, which is something like the institutions of a nation are always menaced and ultimately controlled by the spiritual character of the nation. So if people feel shitty, they tend to act shitty. And there's really no way to get around that. And that's kind of a lesson I learned like with 40 acres, where I did try to start it off being a little more egalitarian, but like those people were broken. And like there was no amount of egalitarianism or like fairness or whatever that was going to heal what was wrong with them and make them able to be good partners with what we were trying to create. So when you're looking at creating an exploitation-free environment, it's not so much about I've got to create a worker-owned co-op. It's you need resources, and then you need a culture that says these resources need to be distributed fairly. And kind of to your point, like, would you prefer a capitalism that creates like materially good outcomes, or would you prefer like, would you rather be right or would you rather improve people's lives? So like when we talk about like why create a worker-owned co-op and you're trying to prevent exploitation, it really is about setting the culture and setting that culture with the right people and then building something where when they come in, they can be taken care of. And for some people, a lot of people don't want to be owners. Like there's so much that's messy about creating a worker-owned co-op, not just like the legal parts, like can you fire them? What happens if they separate? How do you compensate them? What does equity look like? What does membership look like? It also comes down to a lot of people just don't want to be owners. I think, again, that 1% of the left, and I don't think I'm even talking about most people. Like most people, again, just want to be treated fairly. They want to be treated fairly. They want to be able to live their lives and not live hand to mouth. But this idea that everybody wants to be an owner and that like being an owner is the only way to kind of secure your self-determination and to insulate yourself against being exploited. Number one, it's not true. Like there's lots of ways. Like if you see how law firms are organized, like they're partnerships, right? Where like there's varying levels of ownership in like professional corporations or whatever, but there's absolutely ways to squeeze people out, to make their lives miserable, to make sure that, like sue their pants off so they can't get their share if they get let go. Like there's lots of mechanisms to even fire holes into so-called egalitarian modes of organizing businesses. So I think what the left needs to do is focus a lot less on like what is the structure that was described by this guy that lived like 100 years ago and has no fucking idea what it's like to live now.
Doesn't know what the internet is. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what the internet is. Like, especially doesn't know what the internet is. And focus less on that and just focusing more on surrounding yourself with good people and building something with them, whatever the hell it turns out to be. Like, what I'm doing with Blackbird, the reason I'm so reluctant to like consult and prescribe, because a lot of people ask me to like come out to wherever the hell they are, like come to North Carolina, come to California, come to Canada, like help me set up blah blah blah. And I'm like, dude, I don't know you or your people or your situation or whatever well enough to be able to tell you what to do. Like, I'm creating an LLC that's going to be like this holding company with all these like wholly and partly owned subsidiaries, and there's a nonprofit involved and all this other stuff. Like your world might look completely different because like we're cobbling this thing together based on what opportunities I've got, what opportunities my partners have, how much money we got, what our market looks like. Your situation in freaking Colorado might look completely different. Your situation in Mexico, your situation in South America, freaking South Africa, whatever. Like it's we need to worry less about the institutions and more about the people.
I think that's good words. Worry less about the institutions, more about the people. I think that's perfect right there.
I mean, there's a lot of checking that goes on, like with the left, right? It's like
Yeah.
it reminds me of people that are too goddamn academic. Like they want to make sure they have the right answer for everything. Like they're not willing to improvise and like play jazz and like just go where the momentum takes you and shifts you. Like they want to make sure they got all the answers right. Like I created the worker-owned cooperative. Everybody has the exact same amount of interest and share in it. We're doing what Bookchin said. We're doing what Marx said. We're doing what Engels said. Like they want to make sure they're hitting the buttons.
Mm.
And again, it's about fear. Like they don't want to get attacked by these loud ass, like little ass people. But like, if we could just get away from that, get away from the perfectionism, and again, engage that curiosity in making things better for real people, things would get so much better, so much fucking faster.
Yeah, I think this idea of like how do we build things, we need to celebrate failure,
Mm-hmm.
basically. I think is the simple way to think about it. Like we need to celebrate the fact that you tried, right? Which sounds like, I don't know, as a parent, something I feel like we do all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
as we enter adulthood, especially on the left, it's like we don't necessarily do that anymore. And especially if we're trying to buck the trends of, to quote Mark's own words, like the words of the dead weigh on us. I can't remember how the fuck he said it, but basically that history is history weighs down on us and limits our capacity to do new things.
Yeah.
And like the fact that we spent all this time talking about theorists like Marx doing the thing that he said not to let happen is just like circular logic that we're just like so up our own asses, basically.
Like, are we listening? It's
Yeah.
like,
We're
are we
we're
really
reading but not comprehending, or we're
exactly?
comprehending the wrong part. I don't know. Yeah, I agree with basically everything you've said that we need to do something different because this is not working. We have more people on the internet today talking about left-wing ideas or like communicating left-wing ideas across the country. Yet we've never been further from making any material change. I mean, we have a government right now that's basically mocking the left about its opinions on Palestine, and we still can't fucking do anything about it, right?
Yep.
All of our claims about like we have these huge protests and we don't support Kamala Harris or whatever, it doesn't fucking matter because no one cares because we're without capital to back any of our politics up. Like the left had a hard on about Starbucks being down the last 6 months, and they said it was because of the boycott. And then the last week, it's jumped 27%. And it's like all of that loss was recovered within like 4 days.
Yeah, within 4 days. Yeah.
Yeah. So like all that market cap that you supposedly destroyed is back, and like there'll be no conversations about like how to fix that or like what did we do wrong that Starbucks went up 27%. Like that conversation's not going to happen because it was about feeling good that we were protesting something. Not that you shouldn't protest something if you don't believe in it, but like
Mhm.
contextualize that within this greater economy that with a GDP of trillions of dollars, that your $4 Starbucks every day is good for yourself to feel good about how you're using your money,
Mhm.
but economically speaking, it is beyond immaterial. It doesn't fucking matter. And you should be focusing on stuff like you said. How can you engage with your community and create sustainable change? Not just, oh, we held a free fucking light bulb, head light bulb replacement for people that have like headlights bulbs out, right? Like that's great, but that's not a material sustainable change unless you're gonna open up a shop that does that every day. Like, how are you actually creating things that are going to last?
Yeah, and that's yeah, I didn't even know that like certain people were trying to claim that Starbucks tanking was like because of protests or whatever. It's like the whole goddamn market tanked because like Japan's effed up. Like that's all that was. And everybody knew it was going to bounce right back. Like full disclosure right now, as soon as the market tanked like that, I bought a fuck ton of freaking Starbucks. Like I bought Starbucks, I bought FedEx, like I bought it because like it's coming back. Like there's no like nothing's fundamentally changed. Like this is a panic sell. I'm gonna pocket some money on this because like somebody's going to and I'm going to, and I'm going to build my damn chicken factory. That's the thing. Like I talked about this the other day. Like I think part of the reason progress is so frustrated is because certain people try to take credit for things that ain't got nothing to do with them. Like that guy I was arguing with, talking about that, like he like single-handedly friggin' passed the only police reform bill in the country. Where I was like, dude, that was happening anyway. Like that didn't happen because of you. Like what? So like it convinces people to think that like this slacktivism or going beyond the slacktivism like protests and yelling in the streets and doing stuff where you're disengaged from capital and like the real levers of power, like it convinces them that this is working.
Yeah.
It's that whole like Mad Men thing, right, where people need to be told they're okay and what they're doing is okay. I think that does stymie progress when people like me are trying to do something that's a little more deep and permanent and engages with power where power actually is. it gets frustrated by people that are claiming what you're doing is unnecessary and even counterproductive, and you're just trying to join the capitalists because here's where the real progress is being made. For example, Starbucks lost $100 million in market cap because we protest, even though that's false. Like that's a pain. That's part of what frustrates progress. But I think what I've gotten to before is that we got to get beyond that. Like let them talk.
Yeah.
Like let them say their shit, because they can say all they want, but like at the end of the day, no matter how much shit people talk about me, and people talk a lot of shit about me online,
It's mostly me.
that's fine. It doesn't affect my actual progress. Like when you look at it objectively, like it's noise. It's annoying. I've even gotten to the point where I found a way to monetize it. So it's like I welcome the arguments now because again,
Yeah.
all of that engagement money goes straight to my chicken factory, which is what I'm going to use to affect people's real material conditions. So, we need leadership, man. Like that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
We need leadership among a bunch of people who are constantly screaming egalitarianism, where we're talking about like leaderlessness.
Mm.
And frankly, it doesn't work. Like you need someone to lead, to be willing to stand out front, to be willing to like be hated, because people need to also hate their leaders. Like that is a human need that we have. Like we just have to be willing to go back to that, because that is what existed in the past, in the Cold War era and back to the Depression, when we were making these labor gains that caused this version of capitalism that we're in to at least be somewhat tolerable.
I feel like a really good metaphor for the left and like scalability in general, and like this idea of trying to grow this movement is kind of like the Chinese finger trap, right? So you like the two wide ends on one side, you stick your fingers and you pull it, and then there's like this tiny little part in the middle, and either you're squeezed in the middle or you're making a shit ton of money, like the uber rich in capitalism. And at the bottom on the other end is like the left, where it's like we can't get through that tiny funnel of scalability.
Yeah.
And to your point about like you have to have some sense of like community to build like a movement, and there's no like blueprint necessarily that's going to just make it work because you want it to. You have this inverse relationship between scalability and that community. So finding the sweet spot of how much can you scale before you lose that sense of trust and interconnectedness, especially like within a small business or something, or in this case, like maybe a medium-sized business. Like if I were to say, Chris, you want to have a market cap of, of $5 million, $10 million, $100 million. At what point are you going to lose that capacity to have a business that operates the way you want it to without, where do you match that with, okay, I need this kind of scale to get the margins that I need, but also at that point, do I lose that cooperative, not formal cooperative, but that model of egalitarianism that you want within the business?
Yeah, or even that connection to your community, where you're not just like this entity that exists trying to serve these far-flung markets that don't know anything about you, you don't know anything about them. The thing that I tell people is, the people on the left haven't really earned the right to worry about that yet.
Yeah.
Irrelevance and non-existence are a much bigger problem right now than the possibility of getting so big that like we lose our connection to the community. Because right now, like we ain't got shit.
I mean, we also don't have connection to the community, just on the other end.
Yeah, I mean we're already disconnected and fighting each other on the internet, so like we're already screwed. So like we've got nothing
Yeah.
to lose. So like
We think all our neighbors want to kill us for our politics or something.
exactly. So it's like why not try? Because the idea that I don't want to start a laundromat because I might become a billionaire. It's like shut up. Like
Got all those quarters.
it's not going to happen. Like you are not going to become Scrooge McDuck. Like shut the fuck up, start your damn business. For me, when I talk about like pie in the sky ideas, like I could become, if I wanted to, which I do not, but like we could create a billion-dollar business, a multi-billion-dollar business just operating between Baltimore and Richmond. We don't have to be global to make incredible amounts of money, to affect incredible numbers of lives, to have like minimum wages that are like 5-6 times the federal minimum wage or whatever. Like you don't have to, like there's a lot of people in very small places. Where I'm at right now, the market we're intending to serve, like it's over 12 million people. We can make a lot of money serving a very small and kind of geographically isolated slice of that just because of where we are. So it's gonna vary on a case by case basis of like what is too big. When do you lose your sense of community? What does community mean to you? What does, for me, again, like I consider myself more of a fucking stakeholder capitalist, for example, than like somebody going after egalitarian, like no profit, like that whole thing. Like I'm much more in the middle. Again, you're going to lose several $1,000s over this. But like, what does it mean to me to like, at what point am I so far removed from my stakeholders that like I've gone against my mission? And that's going to be different for every business. It's going to be different for every kind of business. Like there's some businesses that aren't necessarily geographically bound. And I think I might have talked about this in the first generation farming book, where there's like lots of different ways to define communities. Like, and geography can be part of it, but a lot of it is, in the age of the internet, like there can be deep connections between people over the damn internet. If you're starting a tech company that's designed to like decentralize banking or finance or something like that, so you can like help people in Palestine get money when they're intentionally shutting down the banking system over there to keep people nice and poor and genocidable, then like the boundaries are different. So it's going to depend on what domain you're in, where you're at, what kind of business you're trying to make, what your goals are. And it's one of those things where like again, I can't there's no formula. Like it all
Yeah.
comes down to like what's in here and I'm pointing at my heart. I keep forgetting people can't see me. It depends on what's like in your heart and in your soul and why are you doing it. And creating businesses that can be guided by your conscience and keeping your eye on that community again is going to have less to do with the institutions and the structures that you create than the people you recruit and who you hold yourself accountable to.
Yeah, I think the accountability is really important. And I think that really boils down to, do you have genuine roots within a community
Mhm.
where there can be accountability when you don't want it, which is when you need it the most, right?
Yep.
Where, yeah, a new brewery opens up and everyone's like, oh, great, there's this new brewery. But does anyone really have any accountability for that brewery when it's not a fun time, or when they're successful, but there's consequences?
Mhm.
That's where the real accountability that's important comes from. But to your point about like how what are we trying to accomplish and how do we get there? I feel like Steve Irwin, have you seen that quote of him talking about like taking money from people?
No.
There's this clip. He's like, I don't care where the money comes from because I'm going to use it for protecting lands. I don't care if it comes from government, comes from an oil person, banker, doesn't matter. Because
Mhm.
if I have it, that means they don't have it, and I can do what's right with it. And that's
Mhm.
kind of how I've kind of evolved my politics on a lot of this stuff of like, is it ethical to invest? Is it ethical to have a business, or to, what kind of business? Is like, well, is that market saturated, or are you creating a new nefarious market? Like, are you creating something that's like super dangerous and selling it to people? Then yeah, that's probably pretty unethical. But like if you're doing, you're brewing beer and it's alcohol that poisons people, like, well, it's not like they wouldn't get it if you weren't there. But the question is, how are you doing it? Are you doing it ethically? Are you providing living wages for people? Are you reinvesting that money in a material way that's going to sustainably improve things in some capacity? That's really important, not on the P&L, purchase profit and loss question that you can ask about, what is this business successful? That's a very personal and, intimate conversation or thought you have to have with yourself about what your goals are and what you expect to accomplish. But I think it's something that we need to start having conversations about to figure out what the hell we're trying to do and what the hell we're trying to accomplish, other than like working for other shitty people who don't give a shit about you, and the money they're not paying you or the staff that you work with is going to fund other shitty things.
I think it's really important to constantly have that centering discussion about why are you doing what you're doing. Even when I joke about, and it's not a joke, actually, I did buy Starbucks when it dipped. But it's like, why? What's the money for? Like, what are you trying to do with this? And in what way are you not necessarily participating in an exploitative system, or in what way are you trying to use the master's tools to fight them? And I know there's this quote that like you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. I fucking disagree. Ask the Iroquois who adopted firearms and like adapted firearms to their own purposes. Like I just imagine that like if these 1% leftists were like were like Oneida or Mohawk or whatever, they'd be over there like freaking hipsters refusing to use guns, just getting shot up while while the Onondaga used guns and were able to preserve their cultural integrity even during a genocide. So no, like sometimes you have to use the master's tools because the master's tool is heavier and bigger, and sometimes somebody just needs their skull bashed in, and a hammer is great, like no matter who friggin' made it. Um, but it's always important to remember, why are you wielding that hammer, and what comes next? And are you now becoming dependent on it? Like what was the point of it? Like what's the soup to nuts plan from, you're picking up the hammer, you're picking up the matchlock, and now you're like fighting this person. Like what comes next? How do you not just become, what the person was who was initially wielding that tool? And so that's something you always have to keep in mind. And that frankly becomes easier when you're not mired in this like permanent state of smallness. This is why I talk about small farms a lot. Like small farms tend to make bad decisions because they're just so like they're so under the gun. Like, the freaking axe is like right here.
Mm.
When you're planning to achieve a certain kind of scale, and I know I'm taking like a hard right turn here, but like when you're planning to achieve a certain kind of scale, you're able to attract investment that'll allow you to plan things well, and where you're not trying to like make the next $100 so you can spend $99, but you've got enough money to have a cushion where you can think, make good decisions, hire well, bring in good people, and not make decisions out of desperation, where when you're making those decisions and you're in the weeds like that, it's very easy to forget why you're doing what you're doing and why maybe you've made compromises that you've made. You might even start to forget that you've made compromises. It's important to go into this with that mindset of what your goals are, and to be sufficiently ambitious to ask for what you need to succeed.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you're going to wind up trapped in the weeds and you're just going to be miserable. And everything we have now, like all the shit that we deal with in late stage capitalism, is because people are miserable, and we got to get away from that.
Yeah, I'd agree. So you mentioned your book. You want to give us a quick summary about it?
Yeah, my book is called First Generation Farming, and I wrote it in a panic when I had that reel go viral, the I'm a Black Farmer reel go viral back in January. And I mean, thousands of people, most of them people of color, in my DMs talking about they wanted to start a small farm. And like, I mean, my asshole just seized up, man. I'm like, you're all about to ruin your lives. So I wrote this book basically as a primer to let people know what the real landscape of farming is. Like there's lots of people that want to quit their jobs in the city, they want to come out to the country, they think it's going to be like this big medicine for them, it's going to solve everything that's wrong with their lives, all the big holes in their soul and shit. And I'm basically telling them that could be true, but not in the way you're being sold, where you need to leave your job, start a small farm, do everything direct to consumer, be like a supply chain of one, an integrated supply chain of one. I think that is a path to a very particular and cruel kind of misery, a path that I have gone down and by the grace of God have gotten away from. So I wrote this book that describes a different way of creating a kind of integrated agribusiness that allows people to pursue food sovereignty and the ability to feed their communities in a way that's different than what conventional agriculture does, but without sacrificing their bodies and minds and friendships and relationships and safety and sanity and all that other stuff. So it's a book that goes into first the history of how agriculture got to be the way it is, both the small farming part and the large farming part. I talk about the mental shifts that I think are necessary to get away from that small farming trap. And then I go into specifics about how Blackbird, which is my agribusiness that I'm working on now with three partners, I go into how we're actually setting that up, how we operate, and questions you need to ask yourself about how to find partners, how to find attorneys and accountants, how to set up certain business structures, and also how to, while you're doing all that, keep an eye on why, again, what we just talked about, why you're actually doing it, what your lifestyle values are, what you were hoping to get out of this, and keep your eye on that so that when you do make compromises, which you will when you're starting a business of any size, you can remember why you made those compromises, how soon you have to stop making those compromises, and what that end state looks like. So that's what the book is. It's intended for people who are not farming right now, who think they want to farm. It's the book I wish I had when I was in that position 11, 12 years ago.
And where can you find it?
You can find it on my Instagram account. It's going to be in my bio. I should just have like a regular website for it, but I don't
You
because
should. I mean, it's like $20. You worked in IT. You should know this.
I did, but I'm too busy killing chickens and doing work. Um, it's like I'm not kidding when I wrote it in a hurry. Like I had no plan. It's just like here it is. It's in the link in my bio on Instagram. So if you go to instagram.com/Sylvanaqua Farms, go to my bio, you'll see the link there in my links, first generation farming. Or if you just Google it, first generation farming, Chris Newman, you'll find it that way. It's like a stand.store thing.
And you're not putting out a print copy anytime soon, right?
Probably not ever. The couple of like actual publishers that have contacted me about it have wanted like they want to tone down the message of it, especially the early part where I talk about the realities of the plantation system and how it led us to where we are now. And I'm not changing that shit. That's the most
No.
important part. And yeah, I think to actually put out a print edition that would, because it's there's a lot of illustrations in it that are kind of important.
Mhm.
And to like get the quality that people are expecting, I'm not going to charge people $150 for a damn book. So yeah, it's just online for now. There will be an expanded audio version coming out probably by Christmas is what my goal is. So I'm gonna go through the book and just kind of riff on each of the key points just for like hours and hours and hours. Like this might be a freaking like 30-hour audiobook. I'm not shitting you. So that'll hopefully be out by Christmas.
Well, this podcast was only supposed to be like a dozen episodes, so watch out. It happens. I'm going to be coming on your
Yeah,
podcast in like
that's
five
okay.
years.
Oh God, no, don't.
Yeah. Any final
No.
thoughts before
Okay.
we wrap up?
Just this, man. We talked a lot about businesses and like the technicals of starting them and the fear and the challenges and all that stuff. But kind of wrapping up with the last theme of what we're talking about is the why. In the world we live in right now, like why are we talking about business? Why are we talking about entrepreneurship? Why is it important? Because a lot of people would like to get away from the idea that kind of the world revolves around businesses right now. It sucks, but that's the hand we were dealt. And you got to play the hand you're dealt. So I think the reason it is so important for people who want more equitable outcomes in society to be conversant about businesses and to start them and to have ambitions for those businesses beyond the freaking coffee shop and the bike shop is because the businesses are how you create the resources to create political change. Like that's it.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, even when people donate to grassroots campaigns, like that, the money they have comes from somewhere. And right now it's coming from Fang, it's coming from Walmart, it's coming from it's coming from the places that we consider to be evil. So if we're going to have command over our own resources, we have to have an organized way of creating these economic centers, i.e. businesses that can frankly influence both people and political processes to get the outcomes that we want.
Yeah.
Because protest is good, it is necessary, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. We have to take that next step beyond knowing what our desires are and shouting them to creating the actual engines of change. And in the world we live in right now, businesses are those engines, for better or for worse.
It does feel very much like the whole mutual aid model. Whether or not you support it, it's still taking, if there's $100, the rich have 95 of it, and
Mm.
people with four of it are giving it to the people who have one of it.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is no, we're going to snatch 20, 30, 40 from that $90
Mm.
and then redistribute it and do it ethically and equitably and without we call it mutual aid, but it's mostly charity. Like without that,
Yeah.
and that I think takes a fundamental shift in how we think about what our purpose and place and how we can honor our ethical, compass.
Yeah, I think it comes down to we have to get very serious about creating dual power. And creating that dual power is going to mean snatching market share away from the incumbent economy. Because right now, like the economy, like that's all there is. That's all we have to affect people's lives right now. And hopefully, 100 years from now, it can be something different. but we have to take that first step. We have to be able to compete with what is there now. We can't just wait for it to collapse and assume that we're going to have a revolution or something, or a collapse that's going to go our way, because it probably won't. We have to do the thing. We have to go on offense and stop trying to like hunker down and again, like share that $4 among ourselves over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to get off the boat to go back to Normandy.
Yes, sir.
Chris, this has been fantastic. It's always fun to have you on, and I'm sure you'll be back again.
Appreciate you, buddy. It's always fun to be here. I'm sorry, there's a hornet in here. You're going to have to edit this out. I'm like, it's so close to my face right now.
He's your buddy. He's like, is this a podcast? Is this live?
He's so excited. I think he might be a leftist. He's pissed off at what I'm saying. It's like, you motherfucker, what'd you say?
Your DMs are going to blow up from like 10,000 hornets later on.
Oh, it's going to be amazing. Yeah. Anyway, trying to remember what the hell I was talking about.